This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Mary Hicks, Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of Chicago, where she teaches the history of the Black Atlantic and Latin America. Her research has been published in Slavery and Abolition, Journal of Global Slavery, and a number of collections on slavery, the Atlantic world, and the meaning of Black history. She is the author of Captive Cosmopolitans, Black Mariners in the World of Atlantic Slavery, 1721 to 1835, which is forthcoming with the University of North Carolina Press. In this conversation, we discuss the past and future of Black studies, with particular attention to questions of language, everyday life as a form of resistance, and how the field of Black studies calls us to rethink what we mean by archives and archival sources. Hello, Mary. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, John?
I'm fantastic. I'm super happy that we have time to talk today about Black studies, about history, about Black Atlantic history, and your sort of field of study, its relationship to both history and Black studies. I think there's a lot to talk about. Obviously, you and I go back a ways. We've shared a department of Black studies. Mm-hmm. So I know a little bit about your thoughts on the field, and I'm really interested to have an extended conversation about it today. And I wanted to start really, before we talk about some of the particularities around the field of Black studies, ask you to narrate a little bit of your intellectual journey. In particular, I want to hear about like what drew you to the study of Black life. You have a very particular historical interest, but you also have broader interests, obviously, as both a writer and as a person and a teacher. So I'm curious what drew you to that study and what sustains you in a commitment to the study of Black life.
Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, just because I think when you're at the precipice, when you've just finished your first book, it's about to come out, and you're thinking about, well, how am I going to talk about this thing that I've been working on for 10 years plus?
Yeah.
How am I going to explain myself? Perhaps apologize for what I've done. I don't know. And then also, how are you going to enter the next projects that are going to define your career? Because I think when you get to that point, you're also thinking about like multiple projects because your interests have metastasized so much. I do find myself going back to the beginning of what inspired me in the first place. And I actually, for the next book I'm working on, which is a bit of a departure thematically from my first book, I wrote a letter to myself that was like basically very self-consciously explaining why I was inspired to do this work. And, a lot of it does end up as a sort of trip down memory lane. And I think, it's two questions. Well, I hope I'm reading this correctly. It's two questions. One, why study Black life? And the second question is like, why study Black life from the perspective and lens that you choose to study it, right? As a Black studies scholar, as an interdisciplinary scholar. So I think why Black life is, a couple things. One is just a sort of personal investment, being Black myself, even though we don't all have to be sort of essentialists about that. I don't think that necessarily determines our intellectual course. Having a personal investment, growing up in a household where Black history was really centered and considered just, my dad collected all these objects of Black history and Black life and Black literature, and they were lining the walls of my house. So it was just like a very strong physical presence all throughout my childhood and early adolescence. And I think the simple reason that I have, and it's probably not the politically correct reason, is that I just think it's like brings me closer to humanity. I think there's just something really human about it. The people I study, the kind of contradictions of their lives, the challenges of their lives, the kind of impossible decisions of their lives, it just makes me feel like a human connection to them in a profound way. And I'm sure there are other historical subjects you could also arrive at that feeling with. But for me, it really is Black people. And when I think about future projects, you can always zoom out and say, well, I want to study this structure, or I want to study this political formation, or I want to study this other thing. But I always come back to, I actually just want to study, Black people and what they were doing. And, and the abstractions can help you make sense of Black life in certain ways, because people are always embedded in larger structures. But I really just want to study the people. And I think that kind of commitment has become more clear to me. As my career has gone on, and you have less, you can't do everything. So you have less time. So you have to decide what your priorities are. So Why Black People is just a sort of a personal choice of what I feel like I connect with. And then why from this lens? Well, I'm sure we're going to get into what Black studies means and what we think the kind of intellectual imperatives of it are. But even going back to my early graduate school education, I took a lot of African history classes with mentors Joe Miller, Hokinalo Fajeda. And it's just not an option, I think, when you're coming at it from that perspective, to be a kind of monodisciplinary scholar, right? You have to, if you take Introduction to African History, you have to engage archaeology, you have to engage economic anthropology, you have to engage art, you have to engage, all these things. You just can't say, I'm going to block myself off and just have this one perspective. So that was very much my training. I taught Black Studies courses when I was a grad student. I was a TA, and taught under Claudrina Harold, who's this great scholar at UVA, and she really drove home, I think, for the undergrads, but also for the people teaching for her, that Black studies is an intellectual tradition, and you actually have to be oriented to, both the future of the field, but also what are the intellectual genealogies that you're actually building off of an implicit conversation with. You always have to be aware of those things. And so I think that's also why I choose to study Black people in the way that I do.
It's so interesting to talk with folks in this podcast series about this first question, sort of what drew you to the study of Black life, and how many people come back to the aesthetics of their childhood, right? Books on a shelf, pictures on the wall. You mentioned these sorts of things yourself. This to me is really fascinating, the way the atmosphere of childhood can be so formative of not just adult interests, but adult commitments. In this case, you dedicated your life to this sort of study. And I will say, you collected these things. And I know this, that one of your father's, I forget what it's called, a little photograph of Frederick Douglass is in the National Museum of African American History. So it was collecting real stuff as well as, I'm sure, ephemera.
Yeah, the daguerreotype, I held that in my hand. It was in a attic in Albion, Iowa, undisturbed for probably 100 years. And this little woman called my dad because she had read about him in the newspaper and said, I found this. I live in an old photographer's home. I found this. Do you want to come buy it for me? So he was... So Frederick Douglass,
this is an amazing phone call.
He was just hanging out there in the most photographed man in 19th century American history. His picture was just sort of hanging out in an attic for 100 years in Iowa.
I love these kinds of just chance, what a phone call. Really. It's I get, my phone call, scam likely, do you want to refinance your home? Your father's getting one. I have this one of a kind. What a crap. Well, let me ask you about how you imagine the field of Black studies. I'm thinking in particular in relation to its origins, because it has a kind of two-part origin story. I think the one that gets a lot of the imagery when we talk about the founding of Black studies is student uprisings, student protests, communities and faculty that join them in that demand representation on a campus. And it was really driven, of course, because it was in the late 1960s and early 1970s, as post-civil rights push for, furthering this question of racial justice, very deeply political question, and very much university community, broadly thought, relationship. But alongside that was, of course, also the development of an intellectual tradition, which you just mentioned. It was part of your own introduction to teaching Black studies, and the need for that tradition to be represented in university curricula and made available for all kinds of students. And so when we imagine, what is Black studies, what is the field of Black studies, it always strikes me, and I know there have been debates, Marable and Gates in particular were the famous version of this, but debates about, where should the field's commitments really be to this political activism or to this intellectual tradition. And the thing about that debate is it goes to the heart of that very founding, that very origin point. So I'm curious to hear how you think about the field in relation to those origins, but, origins, as you know, as an historian, are also revised along the way, and we think differently, but also in relation to them. So imagining the field, its origin point, political activism, intellectual traditions, how does this shape your vision of the field?
Yeah, it's such an important question. So as a historian, of course, I believe we have to understand the past. We have to know where we've been in order to understand where we're going. It's a principal commitment, right? So I think that I've been accustomed to teaching the history of Black studies as, it's generated out of this really potent political mobilization that occurs in the late 1960s. That involves, oftentimes either a small kind of nucleus of Black students in historically white colleges and universities, or in these really multiracial working class public institutions, what we would now call minority serving institutions.
That's San Francisco State in the late 60s, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I've taught Martha Biondi many, many times. She has some great overview of these kind of movements and where they diverge and converge. And I think that is a really powerful and potent story. And I always teach it to undergraduates because I want them to understand that they're not just passive recipients of a curricula, right? That students themselves should have a voice in it. And that, this kind of facile distinction between politics and intellectual engagement just really does not hold for Black people in the academy. And it never has. Especially if you consider for 100 years, our very presence in the academy is a political statement, right? So you can't really depoliticize that. That being said, I do think there's an important lesson in the fact that a lot of the kind of intellectual beginnings of what we consider Black studies now happened outside of the academy. Right. It happened, in the kind of, independent initiatives of Black scholars, or it happened at HBCUs. You have 4 running departments in sociology, which were actually doing heavy historical work with oral histories, in the 1930s at, HBCUs in the South. Right. So you have people like Zora Neale Hurston, who was kind of independent. She was a novelist. She was an essayist. She was an anthropologist. Right. You have people like Du Bois, who had a very ambivalent relationship with the academy and oftentimes couldn't be hired at white institutions. So I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that Black studies as a form of inquiry has always existed outside of the academy, or parallel to or extra to the academy. And I don't think it can be reduced to a institutional formation, right? It's a series of questions, a series of scholarly investments that people had to figure out a way to investigate without institutional support oftentimes. And even just in my own work, I try to take seriously the ideas of Black people in the 18th and the 19th century. People recently arrived from Africa as enslaved people. And, I think you also have to, in the Black studies tradition, sort of acknowledge that Black people have always had their own creative notion of what intellectual life looked like. And that it can't, sometimes it was legible to white institutions, to European epistemic formations, and sometimes it was totally illegible, right? So that kind of form of counter knowledge, or knowledge that doesn't quite fit within what we've like, I guess, traditionally thought of as academic forms of knowledge, as legible forms of intellectualism, is also, I think, part of this tradition. And it's not bound by the institutional form, right? As I said before. So I definitely think we need to say this form of knowledge is something that exists within communities, and that it can't really be bound by the imperatives of the academy fully. Even though that's certainly, the kind of norms of the academy are a huge inducement to thinking about and writing about and talking about Black life in certain ways.
Hearing you talk, I think about all these past experiences I've had with students where they will ask me things like, I remember just a couple of years ago, a student asking in class where James Baldwin had gotten his MFA. And I was like, well, he didn't go to college. He's just, he started off, basically like a journalist that Richard Wright had gotten him a job in Harlem, and, became this essayist. And Richard Wright was a high school dropout, Ellison went to college, and Zora Neale Hurston, but also, we're reading Ida B. Wells, and, the way students are jarred by the fact that these were literally pamphlets people were handing out, like, here, read this. We painted this to a wall. And I think just those moments of, I don't want to call it correction because that sounds almost penal, but but those moments of perspective change, right, underscore the expectations often of students, because this is being presented in a classroom, a Black studies classroom. And so this is an academic space. And then what do we do with that moment where they're like, everything in this academic space is coming from non-academic space production and has this intense intellectual worth? I think that political moment is extremely powerful. And
it's happening all over the world, right? It's not just the United States. It's not just the American Academy, right? We were just talking about the Caribbean and like Sylvia Wynter, and understanding really the kind of like capaciousness of her thought. She's not just coming from a singular tradition or a singular set of questions. And that's because she's formed in the crucible of this very powerful moment of nationalism and the maturation of Black Caribbean thought.
And the way then for both scholars and students, it's like, well, how'd they get this? They read a lot. So if you want to read it, you got to read a lot too. There is no short path for these, but because they were really voracious readers and thinkers and adventurous, but also linked to things that resist representation, I think, in these academic spaces. That way that vernacular culture pulls our reflection in a very different way. And how to make sense of that. I think, what I'm hearing, what you're saying, it really does complicate this. Like, is it sort of political activism or intellectual tradition? It's like, well, what if the intellectual tradition is in the polis, right?
Yeah.
And the activism is both to insert, but also to withdraw. Yeah.
And you can do both, right? Like, as Du Bois was said famously, I'm at Harvard, I'm not of Harvard. So, that's, you I think it's also a embrace of ambivalence or split loyalties. Like, I don't think that's a weakness, right? The need to like fully encompass one category, as a thinker, that is, I think, completely anathema to the Black studies tradition.
So you, as a writer and scholar, have really deep engagement and investment in archival research. Right. And, I know a decent amount about your forthcoming book, really telling, I hate this kind of, it sounds like commercial press blurb, but, like telling untold stories, but, hidden moments in history. And that's what historians, I think, are often looking for. And it generates such potent insights about Black life in the ways you've already talked about the way people live, and the way we have to understand them as full human lives, that touch of humanity, not touch of humanity, but being in touch with the humanity of what's in these archives, what's in these historical stories. And I'm curious how you think about that commitment that you have to the archives and the stories that are buried in there and getting them out and rigorously told, very much the historian's discipline. How you think that extends the field of Black studies? How do you think of that in relation to the field of Black studies?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. There's been a lot of work theorizing the archive in the last 20, 25 years in our field, coming at it from different directions. I mean, there's been a archival skepticism that I think is kind of predominated, especially among certain forms of literary analysis, right? Because, literary folks tend to focus on the narrative, so they can see this narrative is being foreclosed in certain kinds of ways, right? That's Adia Hartman's point. It's being determined in certain kind of ways by white supremacist logics, by capitalist logics. And I think that's been a really powerful kind of challenge to traditional social history, which is the kind of field that I come from, right? Which is reading from below, is trying to read against the grain of documents to understand the lives of subalterns of all different sorts. And I do think we need to engage and grapple with that challenge. I think that the turn I think we need to make, I think it's multiple turns. I also argue in this in my book, which is we need to kind of break apart the archive and recognize that it's not one homogenous or monolithic thing, right? That it's not kind of like the archive, right? These are institutional spaces, but they're also dynamic spaces. And they meant different things, and they functioned in different ways and had different kind of administrative cultures in different times and places, right? So the Latin American archive, which again is a kind of homogenization, but if you are in a colonial Spanish or Portuguese American space, there's going to be certain bureaucratic norms that are structuring the way that people of African descent are engaging with the act of textualizing your perspective, right? Because that's what an archive is, a repository of textualized perspectives. And so for you, I mean, the people I write about who are enslaved mariners, they are in a way more literate than most of the enslaved population, because they're traveling around, they have access to multiple streams of information. They, in their day-to-day lives, probably deal with colonial authorities more than most people, because they have to register as part of ship manifests. They have to do all these kind of sort of daily rituals of engaging the colonial state. And so they're comfortable doing something like going to register a note of debt with the local notary, right? And these are noted down in notarial records. And they're comfortable in textualizing a perspective. They're comfortable in approaching the customs house official and saying, I should legally be free, right? So there's a certain kind of class of enslaved people who actually, paradoxically, because of their laboring life and their kind of the informational networks they're part of, which are mostly produced by other Black people, are confident enough to textualize their own perspectives in certain kinds of ways. So that's the case in a lot of Latin American territories, through the early 19th century, at least. And so I think we should be open to critiques of the archive and the way that power shapes knowledge and what's recorded, without assuming that Black people were totally kind of engulfed in silence, right? And I think many things were silenced for, Black subjects of European, crowns and colonies, but also many other indigenous subjects, women, lots of categories of historical subject. Mm-hmm. But, there are always ways that people find to express themselves. And I think the other turn that I try to make is to say, especially when you're dealing with a pre-20th century society, most people's forms of expressing their consciousness aren't going to necessarily take a written form, right? So where else can we look? And in a way, it's a kind of like de-emphasizing the archive move. So one is to say we need to kind of rethink the archive and think about its specificities. And the second thing is to think about where can we look for repositories of consciousness outside of the textual. And that's a totally Black studies question, right? We were just talking about glissant, thinking about the landscape, thinking about vernacular culture, thinking about all these other spaces. I write about material culture. There's exciting work done by other scholars in my field, Miguel Valerio, who's like talking about like church structures. People have chosen to create certain architectural forms to express their commitments to Black communities in Latin America. There's all sorts of spaces we can look to, or places we can look to, where people sought to express themselves in non-textual ways. So I think, scholars, we also have to be open to other readings of humanity, of expression outside of the textual.
Yeah. So, in some ways that's an answer, response, at least in part, to the next question that I had, which is about that. Then this is maybe more of a personal question about your own experience, because you did your PhD in history at UVA. You've already talked about teaching in Black studies courses, but also I think about a place like UVA, both English and history, and even anthropology. I just have known so many people who end up being very influenced by the presence of the Carter G. Woodson Center, right? And the way that brings Black studies scholarship to all these kinds of different fields. And then you worked at Amherst College, where we worked together for, I don't even know how many years it was. It seemed like 15 or so, but I think it was just compressed. And so you worked in the Black Studies department. You're also in history, but we really claimed you in Black Studies. And now you're in the history department at University of Chicago. So I'm curious, in terms of your research and teaching, the sort of intersection of these, or maybe you want to hold them separate, how these different placements, right, in history for your PhD, in Black Studies, and now back in history, how just that everydayness of departmental life, of the expectations of disciplines and area studies has impacted how you write and think, but also how you teach.
Yeah. I think it's hugely impactful, right? Like we're the sort of, it's inescapable that the intellectual milieu that we're in shapes how we think about our own work. So I guess I've been really lucky in the sense that I don't think I've experienced like hardcore disciplinary, or the need that you can just do this as a historian, because even in my early like graduate training, my professors, my advisors were like, oh, you need to read this work of Latin American social theory, and you need to be fluent in all these different kind of like intellectual traditions to be a competent scholar. So there was never like, let's erect this barrier, and if you step outside of this barrier, the knowledge you create is invalid. That being said, like, I think being at Amherst was a huge moment of intellectual growth for me. Just like learning alongside the students what it meant to be interdisciplinary. Like, technically, yes, I was leading the class, but
yeah, sure.
But it was really learning alongside them in some profound sense, because they would sort of struggle with, okay, well, how do I just like not do this the way any other English scholar would do it, or any other like legal scholar would do this? Like, how do I actually make it Black studies? And, I got to learn from people like you, other colleagues like Rhonda Cobham-Sander, Roland Abiodun, like Olufemi Ivan, like all these people, Karipok, who are doing work that's pushing the boundaries, right? And that also filters into pedagogy. And while I was at Amherst, I also not only taught Black Studies and a key part of the curriculum, which was the research component, but I also was in the African Studies group that was across the 5 colleges, and just learning from my colleagues who were in film, who were in literature, who were in art. And they explained so much to me about African epistemology and what I needed to take seriously, and to the need to look at evidence with fresh eyes, because I thought I knew what was going on looking at this picture of an African man healing someone on the streets of Salvador Bahia, which is what I write about. But I didn't really know what was going on because I didn't know the kind of deeper story and rationale involved. And, that's something I learned from Roland, because he was just sort of like, when I was younger and this plant meant this thing, and I learned from my mother, and, it resonated so much for what I was learning in the 19th century. And then now being in a history department, I think, hopefully my colleagues see that I approach things with a sense of rigor, because I do think in the field of colonial Latin America, we just love to be archive rats. Like, there's just so many people who inspire me, because I'm just like, how did they do this Herculean research? These like little municipal or regional archives, which is really what it takes to tell these stories properly of African life or Indigenous life. And they're just like in there for 10 years and they get
I have to say archive rat is the nerdiest form of rat. I absolutely love this term. It's something to aspire to. Sorry.
I mean, that's the kind of coin of the subfield I think that I'm in. So there is just always that unspoken expectation that you have to be able to really work these archives in a certain kind of way. And I think that gives you credibility as a historian. But then, the active interpretation, like, I love that I can continue to be capacious about the theory that I'm drawing from. Like, the other thing that I learned from being a grad student and then being a Black Studies department is, like, don't be theory phobic, right? Just, they're ways to think about, they present you with ways to think about certain kinds of material and look for larger patterns. It doesn't mean our job is to confirm every theory, right? But it can be a valuable way to reassess evidence. So you need both. Like, I think you need kind of intellectual inspiration and allowing you to rethink something from a different angle that you get from theory. But you also need to draw from the evidence, because I was just sort of surprised by, I mean, you asked me about the kind of unexpressed voices that you're able to uncover in the archive. I was just surprised by, like, literally how much material I was able to find from these people's perspectives. They're laboring people. They're people themselves who had been victims of the transatlantic slave trade, not who you would expect to be able to identify by name, to be able to sketch out a sense of their private lives, even sometimes. Their voices, So there's still a lot of material out there. And I think, it's a shame, because I think some funding that was available for me 10 years ago is it's becoming more challenging to access, right, for younger scholars. But really, to do this kind of research, you have to be able to move around to different archives and to really, like, try to follow up every sort of lead that you can find.
And I have to say, you haven't said this, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, but also sort of a halo around this is, and I'm underscoring this because, like you, I work in not just English language material, the importance of non-English language acquisition for scholars in Black Studies is just so essential, because, as you say, these archives are going to be different in different places, and the way our access to them is so mediated by language, that what's in, U.S. archives or England's archives or Anglophone country archives, they're going to tell different stories than Spanish or Portuguese archives, because archives are also cultural practices of colonial nations, and what gets recorded, what gets saved, what's important, and so forth.
Yeah.
And also, you mentioned Roland Abiodun, and his office was kind of a master's degree. If you were there for the whole lecture, there's a crazy amount to learn. So I like that we share that. And I love that you could have this centuries old question of an image or of a story, and he's able to draw something up from Nigeria. That's special.
And just, the way a mind works too, because for me, I'm not a particularly visual person, even though I like to think I appreciate beautiful things. But for him, it was like he could go into whole kind of soliloquy based on an image or a pattern or, a color, and that's just a different way of thinking.
Yeah. And it is a way of thinking. That's what's special about it. It's thoughtful. It adds so much texture and contour to these things. And he was always on me about when I don't work on Africa, but he was like, you need to start learning some African languages, John. Because I've always been an advocate of learning languages in Black studies. And he was like, where's your African languages, colonizer? And I was like, that's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, that's another thing that's becoming more challenging, right? It's like, I don't want to turn this into a negative story, but, the kind of like language resources that are available for me when I was in graduate school, like, are those still going to be available? Are there still going to be departments in universities that are teaching not just Spanish and French, but also, and Chinese, but also like, Arabic, Yoruba, Swahili, like Portuguese, which was hard to come by when I was, doing my undergraduate education, which was transformative for me, right? Because the other thing that I think is really important for Black studies is to not become insular in any sense, right? Not in the sense of theory, not in the sense of academy, outside the academy divides, and also in the sense of like, we need to travel, we need to like leave the United States and see that there's a whole other world out there, and a different way of thinking about things and doing things, and that, Yeah,
absolutely. Well, you sort of touched on some of the thoughts I have on this particular question. And I'm interested in you thinking back, we're 50 plus years into Black studies being a field, growing as a field. Although, as you say, like the material of Black studies is centuries of experience and expressive culture, et cetera. But thinking about the field of Black studies over the last 50 plus years, I'm curious what you think the field has done particularly well and what you think it has not done particularly well. What do you think of as its stumble?
Ooh, that's a hard question. So one thing I think that it's done well, I mean, I guess it's the old sort of Gilroy idea that Blackness is not an essence, right? That it's a kind of form of counter-hegemonic thought, political action, political consciousness, right? And I think it's not always necessarily like counter-hegemonic. It's just a different way of being and thinking that can't be really encapsulated by the norm, the median, the center, right? And so I think Black studies has had this powerful tradition of thinking from the margins. And, I think in some respects that's empowered a lot of other forms of interdisciplinary study, women's studies, ethnic studies of various stripes, right? Which is like, what happens when you take a question? I was just debating this online. We were talking about this earlier. Much to my shame, debating this online. The development of capitalism. What happens?
It's a real battlefield, so go for it.
Yes, and I keep falling into it, sadly. But what happens when you ask how capitalism develops from the margin rather than the center, right? If you look at the margins of a globalizing capitalist system rather than at like, Lancashire, England, right? And you try to tell the story from Angola, like what happens? And so I think that Black Studies has decentered knowledge, has opened up a lot of new questions, a lot of new ways of approaching familiar material. Like, I don't think we're necessarily like, reinventing the wheel, but it's like, what happens when you revisit these familiar debates or familiar questions or topics from a new angle? So I think Black Studies has done that really well and been instructive to other, like I said, other interdisciplinary fields of study. What it could do better? Oh, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, maybe, just say like, to institutions, you actually need us, and like, we're not superfluous and we're not an afterthought, and actually like really articulate our centrality and importance to inquiry, and to be non-apologetic about that. In a more basic level, I do think like the language thing that you brought up earlier is really important, just because I just imagine the kind of questions that exist out there in the field of like early modern Black history. Imagine if, 10% of the undergraduates who were studying Black history spoke Arabic or could read Arabic or could read, or speak like Quechua. Like that would totally change how they could access those materials and study that history. So I do think that there's a way in which we could include the world in a more kind of like deep and systematic way in our studies, and also create bridges for students and scholars to look outside of their immediate context to really like deepen and enrich the field. So that's more of an intellectual thing. I guess the first thing was just about how, there was this kind of opening in the last 10 years coinciding with Black Lives Matter, interest in Black life, in Black ways of thinking. Perhaps it's being closed a little bit, perhaps not. But I think in the context of that, we have to continue to like express and articulate and be very assertive about this is actually really vital, what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And there's something really interesting about that communication of the vitality of what we're doing, because as you say, I do think there in the past 10, 15 years, there's a particular crisis of Black Studies departments, right? Which, as you were pointing out, so coincides with this surge of interest in the very thing that Black Studies has been dedicated to. But it's also, has for me a relationship to the way that our moment, like the last 10, 15 years moment, leading up to and then post or in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests and everything that's come of that in terms of demands of, what people study, what people learn in the classroom. But that's also filled, history departments, not filled, but added to history departments, English departments, maybe a philosophy department here and there, women and gender studies. All these different departments end up expanding or including, in some cases for the first time, the study of Black life, which gets me to this other question, which is sort of how you think of the destiny of Black studies. And this is a very speculative question, I know, but, if initially it comes because of this lack of representation, right, of Black life in universities, so that you couldn't, go study Black literature in an English department, but you have a Black Studies department, so now you can do it there. It's sort of the destiny of Black Studies ultimately to vanish itself, to so transform the way we think about history, literature, philosophy, art, etc., that eventually those disciplines no longer have a sort of 2-week African-American lit or something, right? That Black literature, the study of Black life in whatever discipline is so pervasive that we really don't need Black studies, right? Because we've changed the disciplines through Black studies 50 plus 100 whatever years. Or is it the case that there's something about the way Black studies has come together as a field that has actually created something that can't be absorbed by disciplines? and therefore really is something that has to survive whatever those disciplines do to study Black life. And as you know, I mean, we had this when we were together at Amherst where, the English department hires somebody in African literature. It's a crisis for Black studies because that's what we do. But then it's like, or isn't the whole point of Black studies so that these departments do it? But we have that sense of being imperiled as a field. But is it also because maybe we don't think enough about what's been unique about our methodologies?
Yeah. And I mean, I think sometimes people don't fully articulate the uniqueness, right? Because it's not like just an additive thing. It's a recentering, right? So it's not just like, oh, I'm going to study modernist poets and add a Black poet. That's not what Black studies is. So yeah, I mean, this is a perennial debate that happens in let's say gender studies, because I mean, in history, people were sort of like, well, there was the gender turn in 90s and now everything's gender. I mean, everything's gendered. We recognize we live in a gendered society, and we have historically. And so there's not really a need for this kind of standalone subfield. I don't think that will happen to Black studies because I think there's a limited elasticity to the historical or traditional disciplines. I think history itself can stretch and accommodate, but it can't fully encompass what Black studies does. So I do think that there's always going to be that kind of limit on the old disciplines to meet the kind of challenge of the perspectives that Black studies offer. I mean, I guess it's two questions, right? Because it's hiring and how it kind of plays out institutionally, which determines so much in terms of what the intellectual space of a university looks like.
Way too much space, but that's real.
Yeah, who can the institution hire and why do they want to hire them, right? And then those decisions are not necessarily made by the faculty themselves. I would like to think that Black studies will endure just because, I mean, I think multiple reasons. I think people like to be in an intellectual space, in the intellectual space that Black studies can provide, right? That is a rejuvenating, inspiring space to be in. And I'm also inspired by being in spaces with other historians, but I wouldn't want to lose the option of being in a space with Black studies scholars. And yeah, I really hope that people understand that it's not just, it's more than the sum of its parts, right? It's the actual kind of intellectual dynamic that's caused by having people from different perspectives and different, that employ different methods coming together. And that it's not just a matter of oh, it's just studying Black stuff. And, you can do that in any department. You don't need to have a community. You don't need to have a conversation. You can just study Black stuff and add that 2 weeks to your syllabus and you're fine. Plus, I mean, I think a lot of scholars did do that. They did sort of take up the challenge of the Black Lives Matter moment and tried to sort of educate themselves on the questions that Black study asks. But I think there's a difference between having a deep training in Black studies and having thought about those questions for decades, years, and actually and picking it up as a kind of novice, which I'm not knocking trying something new and picking up something new. I'm just saying that it's a different quality of thought that you can bring to those questions.
I mean, and I think the not knocking, I didn't take you to be saying that, but, because that stuff's really important. I mean, it's important to have a more diverse syllabus than you used to for a professor, and hopefully also the way that impacts research, but also the way decades of studying multiple kinds of material, music, photographs, architecture, essays, poems, etc., changes you as a thinker. You're not just, reporting texts, right? You actually, something emerges out of that. And I think finding ways for Black studies to articulate dimensions, because it's not one-dimensional, but dimensions of its unique methodology is a real challenge. But it's also something that I find that people who spend years in the field have a lot of thoughts on.
Yeah.
But if you were to ask me, like, is there an anthology on what is Black Studies methodologies? That's an interesting question, right? I can't think of any. I can think of introductions to Black Studies, which assembles texts, but who are we after we've assimilated those into our entire being as scholars and as teachers? I think is a great question.
And it's more than just critical thought, right? Because it's critical thought from a grounded perspective, right? You have to have it grounded in the experiences of Black people to make a critical comment on a larger set of questions.
Yeah. So a last question, when we think about the field as, whatever its institutional future, which I think is, forever going to be up in the air, and something that will reanimate struggle from faculty and students, unfortunately. But, assuming this persists as a field, what do you think, if you were to just say one thing, what is the one thing you think we should be asking about in the coming decade?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think we are actually at a planetary-wide crisis moment. I don't think I would be an alarmist for saying that. Literally, the convergence of multiple crises. Some people call it the polycrisis. I mean, there's all different sort of terminology. We're talking about that, where we can think about intersecting political, social, probably epistemological too, and environmental crises. So I think Black Studies does have to try to meet that moment. I think sometimes it gets glossed maybe a little bit euphemistically as inequality, so much inequality. And I think for me, I'd maybe rephrase it as a question of power, and the kind of hidden and really complicated ways that power operates, which is what I try to at the core of my writing get at, that it's not always just a kind of blunt instrument that tends to be what we can see. So I think Black Studies needs to be that critical voice that says, this is how power is operating, through these institutions, through these ideologies, through, all sorts of things. And say we don't have to, power doesn't have to be configured in this way. It's both diagnostic, this is what's happening, and also, maybe a bit prescriptive, which is, I think, an uncomfortable posture for a lot of academics to take, but to say there are actually alternative visions of the world out there, in Black thought. And that, what would it mean to take those seriously? Because I do think these sort of interlocking crises are not going to just be solved by falling back on oh, here was utopian vision from the early 19th century, which was socialism. It met the moment in the early 19th century, but the world has changed since then. So also being attentive to the fact that not to pick on socialism, I think you could say this about many liberalism, all major ways of dealing with this question of distribution of power. We also have to sort of generate these fresh ways of thinking about the question of how can we distribute power differently that will undo some of these crises, right? That are serious threats to humanity. Again, not to be alarmist, but humanity.
Yeah. I love that. That's a fantastic place to end. While also bleak, but as you said, I don't think we can deny that we are in a particularly bleak polycrisis moment. And I like this idea that Black Studies both has something to say, but also that it's going to require different questions of us and maybe different demeanors. As you say, it seems like people either have the hottest, quickest take or refuse to have a take. And what is our studied, considered, documented, debated, et cetera, way of addressing this moment. I love that. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, Mary. It's been super interesting. And I miss having you as a colleague, but, we have these moments where we get to have a conversation like the olden days.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing this podcast to the public, because I do think it may seem a little bit esoteric, the history of the field. But I think it intersects with so many pressing questions and just, the way people are really questioning the world right now. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. All right. Well, have a great rest of your afternoon.
You too.
All right. Take care.
Bye.